It's well known that Donald Trump has a love for Diet Coke. Well, Zelensky gets himself ejected out of the Oval Office this week. And people that are close around say that when they asked him what he wanted to drink, he said Pepsi. That'll get it done every time. Welcome to Grounded, the place to hear the salty truth. I'm your host, Scott Cates, coming to you live from the Northeast Georgia mountains and the tiny town of Tiger, where it's pleasant today. Been pleasant for the last few days. No doubt the weather has been really very pleasant at this time of year. I think a little bit warmer than usual, but it's pleasant today. Pretty good. Did you see the exchange? I'm sure everyone saw the exchange last Friday with Zelensky and Trump. Man, that was just, if you really could not figure out what took place, there was a lot of speculation on how he got ejected so fast. Well, he literally left hat in hand from the office, Oval Office, hat in hand. And I saw a lot of criticism online of people talking about the fact, well, he wasn't wearing a tie. That might get you ejected. It definitely doesn't show honor. I mean, when Elon Musk will put a tie on and go in to meet with the president, that's a big deal. So, I mean, here is Zelensky. He comes on looking like the poster child for Old Navy and steps on in and then decides that he's going to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. First of all, no one really goes toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, whether you're right or not. When you go toe-to-toe and he believes that he's going to win that argument. He's going to buck up, let's say that. He's actually just going to buck up. But I think what was impressive watching that exchange was watching really Vance sit there and speak up. In his youthfulness, he actually spoke. And I think what's really impressive is that we see a vice president who can actually string together a complete sentence now, which is something we haven't seen in quite some time. And not only that, but he actually is relatively authoritative, does take a leadership position. And it kind of reminds me of looking back in history to what happened in the election that took place in 1901, where William McKinley took office and had Theodore Roosevelt as his running mate. Now, Roosevelt at the time was 15 years younger than McKinley, was very well-spoken, was extremely charismatic as a speaker, Roosevelt was. He handled himself well, and no matter whether, it really did not matter when it came down to it. What took place was, it didn't matter what the argument was, didn't matter whether or not you might have been right or not. Roosevelt usually came out on top, and there were times that he was scolded by, by McKinley, that pulled him in moments and said, wait a minute, you're way over the top here. He was charismatic. He had a sort of a dramatic flair that came with him. And I'm not saying that Vance has a dramatic flair, but I think from watching this exchange the other day, he holds himself well. And I thought it was amazing that Trump let him speak. That's not normal for Donald Trump, who usually overtakes the room. And he really let Vance speak until there was a point where he had enough of listening to Zelensky. And I think it was a great point, valid point, where he said, you're going to feel. He said, don't tell us what we're going to feel. And boy, but they'd had some words, obviously, beforehand from some of the reports that came out of there. And so it's interesting to see sort of that dynamic play out in front of the cameras, yes. But what will come from that, who knows? Who knows? It's just an interesting dynamic. And it brings me to kind of a theme today. I wanted to really cover this theme, and there are a lot of things in my pending pile. We'll get around to that, and we'll actually come back to this exchange, because the theme of the podcast today is knowing when to speak and when not to. There's a time to speak and a time to not speak. And there is, I think, knowing that is an art. Oftentimes we'll get to the point where knowing that can be a movement of the Spirit of God too, that I think a lot of times people ignore. And it really does affect, sometimes they're just their witness for Christ. But anyway, let me just keep on going and just sort of talk about some of the things that are in my pending pile today. Y'all, I've got quite a few things that are there, and I'm excited today about a few things that we're seeing. First of all, coming out of the White House and coming out of just the federal government itself. Are a number of things, the cutbacks that have been taking place. There's a ton of cutbacks that have been taking place. We've talked about that over the last few weeks, but the biggest issue, I think, has been how many agencies are actually cutting back. And listen, seriously, y'all, the reality of right now, it's like a miracle all of a sudden, because now the weatherman is now kept accountable. I mean, it's got to be an amazing moment in history when finally the weatherman is kept accountable for his work. It says hundreds of workers at the U.S. Weather Agency, NOAA, are fired. Well, man, this is kind of amazing because the weatherman has the job. And to be honest with you, with the weatherman, he predicts, quotes, and predicts the weather. How many weathermen does it take? You know, the question would be, how many weathermen does it take to screw in a light bulb? How many weathermen does it take to sit around a computer screen that is going to give you the computer models? You see, actually, when hurricanes come on, what looks like spaghetti from all of the computer models, they just don't know. And I don't know exactly what the expectation is for a weatherman. Well, if you blow the weather, 15 times, maybe it's like 77 times, 70 times 7 times. That's exact. Maybe it's 70 times 7 times. That's what it is. The weatherman gets the weather wrong 70 times 7. Maybe that's it. That's the end of forgiveness. You get fired. I have no idea. But I do know that when it comes to the federal government calling the weather, if you look at the propaganda that has come out over the last 4 years, and I've joked about this. Honestly, I have joked about this for the last 4 years about the media not being able to be predictable because of the reports that are coming out of the White House. And then the reports of the weather agency. When we got back to the naming of winter storms, or the naming of storm systems that were coming in the middle of the U.S., I get naming a hurricane. I do get that. But naming winter storms, goodness gracious, how much drama do you have to add to the weather? All you have to say is a blizzard is coming. It's going to be here for a while. Or, we have tornadoes expected to touch down. Weather system, Bertha is coming through. It's not necessary. But it's one more piece of drama to ramp up because it's included sort of like media. So here's the point I'm trying to make. We already knew that the weatherman's forecast was sort of up in the air anyway. Especially if you live here in the tiny town of Tiger, where they can predict 70 and sunny 2 days from now, and it snow. Especially at this time of year, no one can predict the weather well or 100% correct because only God knows what's coming in, just a reality. But then when you begin to start looking at the federal government and the reports that have come out and the propaganda that has come out to sort of cover up so much stuff that Trump is now uncovering, really, in the middle of it, who really did expect to be able to trust anything coming out of that anyway, let alone the weather? So, of course, the weather agency is going to be letting go of some of their people that are there. Hundreds of workers are being let go. Some of those, and obviously, some of those are in the probationary period, but others are just, and you see where Trump and they're looking at this and saying, my goodness, this is so over bloated. We don't need this. And then On top of the NOAA, the U.S. Weather Agency here. On top of that, we see that the EPA. That's the next thing. And of course, we see the EPA. The EPA is kind of Environmental Protection Agency. It's the environmental protection, bottom line, that has sort of gotten us into this climate green whatever anyway. And so they've been hit with an option of what to do. So they have to restructure. And in this, they've been given an option. And it's either stop your spending or let people go. And so they've done something that is sort of landmark here, really. And they've said, well, our people are our most valuable resource. That's not something you see in 2025. Most of the time, they just let people go. That's the quickest way you can cut cost. It is. But it might not be the most effective way to cut your cost. But the EPA has come to miraculous terms for the federal government. And they said, we will cut 65% of our spending in order to keep our people. It's pretty honorable. And I think probably the first time a government agency is willing to cut its spending to keep its people. Interesting. And then Social Security on top of that announces their significant workforce reduction. Well, of course they are. Of course they are. And part of the issue is the fact that there were enough people hired to go around for Social Security that you could have picked up the phone and called. But on the first tour walkthrough of the new director going through even the Atlanta office, they found just an empty office building of all of these people who just were not even coming to work. And it's sometime in 2020, they'd been let loose for COVID, and they were actually under the Biden administration going to be given till, about 4 years from now, still at this point, before they ended up having to come back to work. They were extending the COVID mandates, which is not something that if you're working in a civilian job, you get the opportunity to do, unless you worked in San Francisco. And then we see, miracle of miracles, folks. The miracle of miracles is that in San Francisco, this article just out, which was an interesting article to me, we see this happening. San Francisco, of all places. The San Francisco mayor orders the city workers back to office to work 4 days a week, back to their office. They've been out since 2021, and they've been riding the whole COVID farce since 2021. And it really, don't get me wrong, people died in COVID. We've talked about that, but not at the numbers that were, pushed in the day. They weren't. And so, and then the science, quote unquote science, the federal propaganda that popped all of that up in the process of and the whole idea, the crazy idea of, well, if you isolate yourself, this will go away. That's the whole, man, let's do this. And to be honest with you, if you look back at it, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because once people actually do get together, they're going to, at some point, you can't just leave them isolated. When they do get together, that immune system actually builds up. And as it does, people overcome this, and this is what we've seen has happened today. But to take the idea like a child and say, let's just pull the covers over our head and maybe it'll go away. Let's lock ourselves in our bedroom. Well, the truth is that by doing that and creating that isolation, when you finally open the doors and come out, the problem is far worse than it was before. So everybody gets hit with it anyway. They got to come out of that anyway. But it was recommended for the idea of science. And then they've just kept it on and kept it on and kept it on. Well, the amazing part, this is what blows my mind. The amazing part about all the people of the Social Security Administration and all the people that are working for in San Francisco, man, they're still going out. They're going out to restaurants to eat. They're still going out to Walmart. They're still going out on Friday nights, but we can't make it to work. Yeah. So it's a miracle, San Francisco, when the city of San Francisco follows suit and they call their people back to work. Miracles do occur, don't they? It's interesting. At the same time, out there in California, we see Newsom and all of the people trying to rise up right now and try to overthrow him as the governor. This guy actually ends up, it blows my mind. We just saw a debate between him and DeSantis last year, and they end that debate early. It's been called, really, they say it was called by Newsom's wife, who stepped in and said, "It ends here," basically, and as a result of that, who would have thought that Newsom for the Democrats would be where he is today? That, man, it has really cost him. It has really cost him. And people have stood up, the fires, all of those things that have happened. So a lot of things are taking place now. Truth is coming out, and truth is actually prevailing. That's not bad. It's good. So my pending file today, the fact that history is, my goodness, miracles actually never cease to occur. San Francisco goes back to work. The Social Security Administration, we talked about this a few weeks ago, has been called to come back to work. Interesting. And then finally, the weather, the U.S. Weather Agency, and all that's going on with that. Interesting, actually. All of it is. It really is. There's more. I could go with more headlines on all the cutbacks, but I just picked a few today. The pending pile today. Also in the pending pile today, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but Microsoft is finally shutting down Skype. Skype's been in existence probably 20 years or more, I would guess, somewhere around there. Microsoft is finally going to shut down Skype. Now, I remember the multiple times I'd been overseas and the ability to be able to talk on Skype at one point and having that was good. And now technology has become what it is today. But about 15 years ago, when I was basically all over the world, from the Arctic Circle to the desert in Africa to to Costa Rica all over the place, all over. Outside of the U.S., Skype ended up being a valuable tool in the day. Technology is rapidly advancing so that Skype was actually not needed. And to be honest with you, if you look at even the COVID season that we were in at the time, technology advanced greatly. We discovered a lot about technology because it really became our go-to during that time. And so that's where we are. Now, my question is this, and I look back, and what happens when you get addicted to isolation? This is the question. What about these workers that haven't been to work? What happens when you get addicted to isolation? I think it was Jim Carrey, basically, that talked about the fact he'd walked away from Hollywood and he had gotten himself isolated for more than a year, and he got addicted to it. He said you get addicted to you get addicted to the solitude. You get addicted to the fact that there aren't people around. You just get addicted to the quiet, and it's very, very hard to get back up. So after 4 years of being isolated and not having to work, how will they actually be able to go back into the office and function? Well, it's going to be interesting. I would say there's going to be, at first, maybe they're not going to be thrilled to walk back into their offices, for sure. So there's going to be, the grump factor probably will be pretty huge, I would think. And a little infighting in office will be interesting. Who's in charge of what? And some expectation that has not been there will be on display and publicly on display. Public expectation, which always brings a better quality of work. It just does. Usually. When the person who's judging the quality of work is basically non-biased, which means it ain't the good old boy network. It means that usually it makes for a good workplace. So the retraining, actually it's going to be the retooling of all of that. I cannot imagine how intense that's going to be in government organizations. And they've got enough empty rooms at this point, and they've fired enough people that they should be able to have, the cry rooms that might be necessary for people to go and cry in. I'm not sure. Maybe they'll give them a little bit of, maybe like 15 minutes or 20 minutes of cry time to weep over the fact they had to go back to work. I don't know. Maybe that's the answer. I'm not sure. But you can bet that after 4 years of isolation, 4 to 5 years of complete isolation for federal workers in the San Francisco area, 4 years of complete isolation, not having to work, but isolation. And folks, listen to me. I'm telling you, being online and thinking that online is going to take the place of day-to-day, face-to-face contact, it isn't the same. And those of us that work in civilian areas that are outside of government understand and know that. There's an expectation to your work, because if you don't work and you don't do it with some sort of quality, you just usually get fired for the most part, especially in areas that are pretty conservative. That's exactly what happens. So there's an incentive, and that incentive is to work hard. And that incentive is to make people work, or the incentive to work hard is what makes people thrive and keep going. Now, when you get into government jobs, not a lot of incentive there, usually. And the whole idea was, I've been in my government my whole life. I've worked here. I've been a civil service employee my whole life. And, and pretty much your job was guaranteed. And the great part about being a government worker most of the time was there was really not an enormous amount of quote unquote stress, not like there is happening in moving civilian job. But there just wasn't a whole lot of, intense stress, which meant that you could get off of work if you're a government worker sometime between like 1 o'clock and 4 in the afternoon. And when you show up somewhere between 8 and 10, you can get off at 1 o'clock and 4 by the afternoon. For those areas that don't usually keep track of time, and many of them don't. This is a joke, by the way. I'm just kidding on that. Don't take it personal if you're a government worker, because I know many of them do work hard. But I know a lot of them that did not. And the ongoing joke was when someone said, well, I work civil service. I'm working in the civil service. It was sort of like, oh. That kind of mentality. And that is what is the mentality for a lot of people. But there are some that work well. They do. Many that work well. Don't get me wrong. And that you pretty much, if you got yourself a civil service job, that you were on easy street until you finally retired. Or if you got yourself a job with the government, you were on easy street, because once you got in to get out, well, that was next to impossible until now. Accountability, well, it's pretty interesting. So, and accountability for work, I mean, it's good. It's biblical. It's there. It is. It's good. I do want to go back. Those are a few things that are in my pending pile today. Now, I've got one more. I've got one more thing I do want to look at. Did you see, for those of you that are interested in like old ships and, sunken ships, things like that, did you see that the SS United States, for those of you that don't know what this is, big ocean liner that had been in retirement, and it had been in Philadelphia just sitting, rotting since the early 80s. If you want to get interested in that, you can go online and you can look up the SS United States. And if you want to, you can look, just type the SS United States interior, and there's a guy that filmed the SS United States, and he toured through it in 1984 while it was sitting in retirement. And what it looked like in 1984. Now, it's completely, since 84 to today, it had been completely gutted. There was a conservatorship that was trying to make it, and it's actually been a historic landmark. There's no doubt about that. They've sort of established that, but they didn't know what to do with it. And there have been failed attempts at restoration and people purchasing it for whatever. Well, Okaloosa County, Florida purchased this. And it's been in tow from Philadelphia, and it's headed toward Mobile, I guess, or was heading toward Mobile. and they're going to gut it. And somewhere off the coast of Fort Walton Beach and Destin, Florida, they're going to sink it. And it's going to be the largest artificial reef in the world for divers. Now, if you've been to that area and they have a number of artificial reefs that are right there in that area. They just sink and people can go dive on those wrecks. So that's interesting coming up. So I'm not sure when they actually get finished with it. They'll tow it, I guess, from Mobile eventually at some point, and it'll get towed over to Okaloosa County, Florida, and off the coast of Fort Walton, Destin. They'll sink it right there. I'm sure there'll be a great, party on that day or whatever, celebration on that day when it's finally quote unquote laid to rest. And it'll be the largest man-made reef in the world. It's sad in some ways because it would have been great to have seen it. If you go back and you look at some of the photos and how great that ship was in the day, it's sad to see that part of history sort of disappear. But understanding that the multi-millions of dollars it would have taken to do anything with it, probably in the billion-dollar range because of how deteriorated it finally became of just from not being taken care of. And then everything being gutted out of it. This was the only thing that they could actually do. So coming up soon, somewhere down the path here, down the road, the SS United States will finally find its resting place. And that's what's on my pending pile today. I want to go back to the discussion with Zelensky and Trump for just a minute, and we'll get into this theme of knowing when to speak and when not to. Because what ends up happening is the intention in the White House, I think, on that day, and the intention for everyone involved, was to really go through with the plan. And the plan basically from the Trump administration was, let some American interests come into your area. If you'll let American interests come into your area, we can mine for minerals that are there and purchase the minerals that are coming out of your country. There will be an invested American interest there, and that it will deter Russia from coming to take that over. Because if you violate American interest, that brings retaliation from the United States. And it always does. It always has. I mean, go all the way back really to to Kuwait, that during the American interest in the oil of Kuwait, when Iraq decided they were going to go take over Kuwait, American interest that was there, we weren't going to do that. And so we went in to stop all of that. Yes, for the Kuwaiti people, but we also had vested interest there. Makes sense. Always has made sense. And always has been a part of history. But Zelensky came in, and I'm not sure if he tried. I think he was trying to do the whole Tom Cruise thing right in front of the cameras, but the sad part about that is that at a time when he should have listened and had some humility, he was bold, and then even came to the point of when Trump actually interacted in the conversation live there. He came to the point of almost a threatening tone. You enjoy a great ocean, but you just wait, that kind of thing. And when the threatening tone came, that was basically, there's a time to speak and a time to know when not to. That clearly was not the time to step up and speak with the most powerful nation really in the world when you are a tiny little cog in the wheel. That's really just reality. I'm not trying to criticize, too much here. I'm just trying to say there's a time to know when to speak and when not to. And it's interesting. In the book of Proverbs, there are some verses in the book of Proverbs that are just amazing verses. I look at the verses in Proverbs that when you come down to it, the ones about when to speak and when not to. And so I look at this at Proverbs 17:28, and there's a couple of different really interpretations, but there's a couple. And it basically, the bottom line, it says, even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and in discerning how to hold their tongue. And discerning if they hold their tongues. So, but there's a couple of different interpretations that are here that I'm going to read off to you. It says, even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouths shut, they actually seem intelligent. Even when a fool holds his peace, it's counted as wise. And when he shuts his lips, he's esteemed a man of understanding. There's much to be said about silence. Now, the reason why I'm actually discussing this today is because I've been known through the years to not be silent when I needed to. And I still fight with that in moments, personally. I do. To push the things that I know are right and to stand for those things that I know are true, those are important. But the timing of all that, well, that's always interesting. What I think I've learned over the last few years, and probably the book that helped me the most over all of this, and been written a long time ago, probably almost 100 years ago, I'm thinking somewhere around there, is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. This book, all by itself, is an interesting book. Carnegie wrote this book. I don't know how many republishings this book has had, but many. I've actually got a leather-bound edition of this book because it actually intrigued me to read it. And the book, when you look at it, it's not about how to manipulate. It has nothing to do with how to manipulate, but it's a book teaching you how to be a better listener. It's also a book that teaches you about how to really set yourself in last place, which is really good because it allows you to allow someone to bring whatever it is that they are saying to you, and you actually listen, let them speak. And it also goes through the point of trying to get you to ask them, hey, tell me about you. Tell me about your story. I usually start conversations with people and I ask the question. I usually say, hey, tell me about your world. So what's going on in your world? And I truly want to know their story. I love their stories. As a matter of fact, you know from the podcast that I actually talk oftentimes about other people and their stories because they are amazing. It's amazing. We see actually what famous people, and we know the stories of their lives. I love to read biographies on successful people, but I also love to read biographies on people that failed miserably too, as well, to sort of learn from both things. But the reality here in How to Win Friends and Influence People, as I tell you about that, is how to become really a good listener. Listen to them. Give them a listening ear. Because most of the time what happens is once a person tells you their story, you've earned the right, oftentimes because you listened, they want to listen. You've earned the right to be heard. And oftentimes in a reciprocating question, they say, well, what about yours? Or gives you an opportunity to talk about or ask questions about their story and where they are. I find this oftentimes in a person. So many people want to talk and prove their point. So many people want to talk over someone else to prove their point. So they just get louder or they push harder or whatever. And they speak more words or whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is when it comes back, this proverb is really true. That even when a fool is quiet, he's considered to be wise. And he's actually esteemed in his silence. And so the reality of this is knowing when to speak and when not to. This is an art in some ways. Let me explain. Earning the right to be heard is important for us, I think. And this happens, and this is interesting. And I really thought, when I read this book about, 30 years ago, and then have picked it up through the years. It's been really good, and it helps with starting conversations. It's been really great at that. But what I've discovered is, in later generations, when you get past Generation X and you start getting into millennials and you begin to get into, now the current generation that is out there at this point, that the later generations that have been born or are grown up basically as teenagers in the 90s and forward, 1990s and forward, I found when I say, well, tell me about your world, that they've been so used to isolation and have grown up with actually some form of messaging, like we have, now with your phone. They at one point they were in Yahoo Messenger or that sort of thing when email began or whatever, started to communicate like that, and so not really used to day-to-day conversation. Let me encourage you, if you're a parent or if you're a grandparent, to really work with your children and grandchildren on day-to-day conversation with adults. The isolation there that is oftentimes created in a family, and the emotional neglect oftentimes. And I don't think parents really realize that's what they're doing. But there's emotional neglect that actually comes, which creates problems later on in the future. I encourage you to encourage that conversation. Ask what's going on. And really look for answers that are better than I'm good or I'm fine or that kind of thing. Because I find in conversations oftentimes that if I say, tell me about your world, they go, it's good. It's fine. I hear those kind of responses. So tell me what's going on. What have you been up to? And ask those questions. Now, this is interesting because I discovered also that there's a fine line, especially with later generations, because most people want to tell you about their story. What I've discovered with later generations is they'd rather blog it. They really would. They'd rather write it out on a blog, or they'd rather do it online where a lot of people can look, that there's really no feedback there. So that when you actually do get to the point where you say, hey, face to face, you say, tell me about your story. If you ask too many questions, they actually get aggravated. And they look and they go, what is this? The third degree? I mean, really, I've had people actually say that before. I'm like, no, I'm just interested in you. So there's a fine line even in that now, which I've become really shocked over the last probably 5 years of stepping up and asking those questions. Hey, tell me about your world, and getting responded to with why? What's it to you? Or, this just has really shocked me. Because in Carnegie's book, it says that the majority of people really would love to tell you their story. And I find that on many occasions is the case. Until I get to a later generation. And those later generations are so used to that isolation that it gives them great anxiety to speak, let alone talk about themselves. And oftentimes, the reason why they don't want to talk about themselves is because they don't believe they've achieved much or ever will. And that's what brings that anxiety. But anyway, as you move forward, knowing when to speak and when not to. Finally, we also get to the other side where people are unwilling to listen at any cost. And I see this happen with people who believe in Jesus Christ, that want to talk about their faith and their incredible ability to speak about what's right, and they're going to overpower with truth and authority every single time. And I understand. I do. But I also understand that the scripture says that we are ambassadors for Christ. So some diplomacy is actually required. And it is. I look at Paul, who says, to the weak I became weak, to the strong I became strong, to the ones without law I became like ones without law, even though I had the law. And he said, I've become all things to all men in order that I might save some. And sometimes I wonder if this has been forgotten. That doesn't mean that I behave as someone without the law. And it doesn't mean that it means that when Paul went into places, he was willing to listen to them speak and earned the right to be heard, and stepped up and was able to speak. So I see this with believers. And I see it today with a lot of the aggression that is going on from the sides of conservative and liberal. There's so much volume and fury or whatever that is happening there that no one will stop to take the time to actually listen and allow someone to feel like they've been heard. The truth is, there's not anything at this point that when I sit down that is going to shake the foundation of faith for me that I know of at this point. And I'm not trying to say that to sort of brag. I'm just saying I settled what I believe. Like Billy Graham went out. It's funny when I look at this, and one of the greatest things with Billy Graham that I thought was amazing is he actually took the Bible and he went out and he found a stump and he laid the Bible on the stump and he said, "Lord, just like I accepted you as Savior, help me to accept that this and settle in my soul, basically, that this is absolute truth and that your word is pure." And he prayed that prayer and he settled it in his soul. That's what's settled, should be settled in the souls of believers, I think. And the result of that is we know what we believe. And there are people that have tried to shake that. I've had Muslim clerics come and tried to shake it, and do that. And I say, well, that's all fine and dandy as they are running in moments to pursue God. They're running to pursue God. But I also know, and I relate back, this is where the witness is important. There are many parts to being a believer and how we actually explain how real God truly is in our lives. There are going to be days that we're baptizing and teaching, like Matthew 28. There are going to be days that we're preaching the gospel to every creature, like at the end of Mark. And then there are going to be days, like in Acts 1:8, that will be witnesses to all the nations. And the witness is like an eyewitness account of what God has done in our life. And so the one thing, it's amazing, really, that the preaching of the gospel and taking the scripture and talking about the good news of Jesus is important. The teaching and the baptizing and teaching others in the things that have been commanded in Matthew 28, that's important. But the witness, the actual eyewitness, the witness of what Christ has done in your life, well, that is solely yours. And it is. Each person has a different eyewitness account. And for those of you that know what I mean, when you're transformed in Christ Jesus and the power of the Spirit of God comes upon you and you're guided and you're led in all truth, that's amazing. Because once you actually surrender all that you are to Christ, man, the ride is on. Hold on to the reins. Because everywhere you begin to go and all of the things that happen, they don't happen by chance and circumstance. You see God at work here and here and here and here. Now, that is if you actually truly do surrender your life. Now, don't get me wrong. There are days you are going to wander. But on the days that you're not wandering, it's like God says, can you see me now? Can you see me now? Hey, here I am. And so in the discussion with many people who try to sort of explain away the faith, in the return of the conversation is the eyewitness account, where I'm able to actually say, well, you know what? At the preaching of Jesus Christ and at the name of Jesus Christ, I have seen these things actually occur. I've seen the transformation of men. I've seen 4 storm systems come together in the middle of Africa in order for people to come to know Christ by an act and a movement of God. I can literally go from account to account to account to tell you where God came onto the scene, moved mightily, and transformed the lives individually, each one, and transformed them. I could talk about that personal transformation that cannot be talked about in any other faith, really. There's a personal transformation where the Spirit of God comes to life inside of a believer in Jesus Christ, where others are still, what they're doing is they're like training. They're constantly training all the time to try to be more and more and more. And when the transformation has come by the work of Christ within us, which causes us and compels us to be better, if that all makes sense. Hopefully it does here in that moment. But when I'm in conversations with many of these people, and I actually sat at the Rusty Bike Cafe in Clayton, Georgia, every single morning for about 7 years, I sat there and I waited as people came in. And I listened to conversations on political things, and I listened to conversations on spiritual things. But I also sat there in moments where people came to actually come and sit down, and in conversation, they really just wanted to get into some dialogue and really know. And I got into some conversations and I listened. And I never let out of the box. I never did. I never pulled out of the box in them. I was very quiet about what I believed at first. Not to say that I hid it. I didn't. I wanted to listen to what they believed. And when they finally came to the question and said, well, what about you? I was able to actually come back around and say, well, this is what I believe. And when that open door conversation, it's been interesting. It's really been interesting because, and I think I shared this on the podcast, but just even in one instance I can think of right now at the top of my mind was a staff sergeant in the Army that literally had come. He had been leading men. He'd been in Afghanistan, and he had had a number of suicides that had taken place in his regiment. And in that, he had gone on leave, and he just decided to take some time away because he was really suffering at the soul. How do I lead to these men? I don't really know what to do. And he didn't exactly know, but he was not open to anything religious whatsoever. And he ends up over in Helen. He ends up over in the city of Helen, which is a few miles from here, 30 miles or so from here. And so he ends up in the city of Helen. He ends up at a restaurant called Paul's over there. And as he's sitting in that restaurant, eating and talking, the waitress comes over and he begins to just talk. She says, well, tell me about you. And I don't even know the waitress's name. All I know is she says, tell me about you. And he begins to talk about what he's going through in life. And he just decided to come to Helen because he was just looking for anything at some point. And she said, you need to leave here. And tomorrow you need to be in Clayton and you need to go and pull up and you'll see there's a white car, this old car that's parked out front. And if that white old car that is there, it's a 1954 that I usually drive. But if that 1954 basically is sitting there is what she was trying to tell him. She said, go in and look for a man named Scott. So, I don't know any of this, but I'm sitting at the end, all the way at the other end of the breakfast bar that is there. And I'm on a stool down there just drinking coffee. And in walks this guy, and he sits about three or four seats down, and he asks the waitress, I think it might have been Kim, and he asked him, he said, I'm looking for Scott. And she said, well, he's right down here, and she put him right next to me. And I said, what's going on? And he tells me this story. I've been in Helen. I talked to this lady that said to come over and talk to you, that you have something that you can tell me. And I said, well, tell me about you. And he told me the whole story that I've just told you. And at the end of it, he said, what do you think? And I said, well, the question is, what do you think? And I said, no matter what I say, will you listen? He said, that all depends. And I began to talk to him about Jesus, about how you lead men with Jesus, how to really find hope and how to actually be able to lead men in hope and to be honestly a bright light in hope and in love. Talk to him about that. And I said, are you hearing me? He said, normally I wouldn't give you the time of day, but this is speaking directly to something inside of me. By the end of that conversation, I said, the question is now, after what I've said to you, will you accept Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord? And that's all up to you. I'm not pressuring you today. He goes, no. He said, I would have never considered that in my life. But today, right now, I need that more than ever. And right there at the breakfast bar, while we were sitting there, we bowed heads. He prayed and asked Jesus to come into his life and save him. And I promise you, when he looked up, his countenance, the look, the darkness that he carried into that room, he had let go to Christ, and it changed him. Now, folks, there's the timing that's there. And if I'd have overpowered him in that moment, he'd have never listened to me, not 1 second. We've been given an authority, yes. We've been given, and it's amazing, we've been given this amazing power to speak in the Spirit of God. Created in the image of God, which is amazing, yes, but created in the image of God without the ability to speak things into existence. For instance, give you an example. At the beginning, it was Jesus, basically, at the beginning, God, who says, let there be light, and there's light. He's able to speak, and the power to create by speech. With a believer in Jesus Christ, the only time we ever get to see that literal let there be light take place is when someone comes in darkness and you speak to them about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And at the moment, there's a unique combination of the breath of God through the power of the Holy Spirit and the breath of the man at the same exact time that's breathed the gospel out that really is, in a nutshell, let there be light. And when they accept Christ, we get to see that transformation and that power happen right then in their life. And what's behind that is powerful. And it happens by the power of speech and the power of the Spirit of God. That's how it doesn't happen any other way. And they're transformed because the gospel comes to them, they hear it, and they're willing to submit to the power. They're really just willing to submit their lives to Jesus, and it changes them. Knowing when to speak is powerful, and then knowing when not to speak. Because there are also other times that I get involved and I say, tell me about your world, and I get down to it and I begin to talk about spiritual things, and they're not open. I don't just kick in the door there. I don't just go, oh, yeah? I don't just Yosemite Sam up like Trump in some ways and go, better say your prayers. I don't go there. I don't. And I know a lot of people that do. They just overpower that, and they slam the door shut like crazy as the person walks off and says, what a fool in that moment, because we never shut up long enough to listen. There's something to be said in the power of silence and the ability to listen. And there's something to be said when literally the Spirit of God speaks to our heart to pierce the darkness of that silence in the moment to bring light. And knowing that has much to do with discernment, yes. But it also has much to do with wisdom. Now, that's talking about the gospel, but I'm talking about an everyday conversation. Personally, when I'm talking to people and getting to know them, I get excited about hearing their story. I get excited in conversation. But as I've gotten older, I've understood that not every time someone shares with me their story that I have to actually answer back a comparing story that says, I understand where you're going. Sometimes I just need to listen. And I realize sometimes I answer back. And then I just a simple idea of that is if you're asking somebody where they went to go to a restaurant. I went and I ate over here. I ate at say Marco's Pizza restaurant. Yeah, I was at that same restaurant. And that's what we do. We say, I ate over there at Marco's Pizza restaurant, and it was really good. And this is the case. And then we want to share a comparing story. So we just interchime and go, I ate over there too. And I ate that as well. And we do that. But sometimes there are times and moments that we don't need to respond with a corresponding story about our life. But we need to just stop for a minute and be quiet. Because sometimes people just need to get it out. And they don't need it to fix it. Or they don't need a corresponding answer that, and this is hard for those of you that are older than Generation X and older, because we want to fix it. And we want to give an answer that we think is going to be, and there are times for that. But allowing for those times of silence and knowing when to pierce the darkness with the words that we speak. Knowing when to build up just at the right time. There's a great amount of discernment that comes with that. And there's an art in wisdom that comes with that as well. And in a generation, it's literally filled with basically an enormous amount of dismissive avoidance as far as like their attachment characteristics and how they attach to people. The dismissive avoidance because they've not done anything but been avoided their whole life. That when you begin to talk to them, they just push you farther and farther away. or you ask questions, they push you farther away. Or when they believe that you care, they push you farther away. Sometimes we just need to practice some disciplined silence. And in the moment that they're ready to speak, let them. Now, as far as children are concerned, start now. Getting in conversation with your kids, letting them come, talking to them about the things that they're facing in life, and being available is important. I'm not talking about sitting across the room on your phone and texting back and forth to your kid. I'm talking about put your phones down, look at each other in the eye, have conversation, set your kids in your lap, be touchable. Be touchable, be approachable, be a listener. Speak so that your voice, moms, dads, grandparents, will split the darkness. Start that when they're a child. And I promise you, when they're an adult, they'll come back at some point and they'll look for that same voice that helped them to overcome the darkness. Knowing when to speak and when not to is an art. And even a fool in his silence is perceived to be wise. And that's where we are today. You've been listening to Grounded, the place to hear the salty truth. What does all of it mean? Well, first of all, let me say that it does, just like I told you about the staff sergeant that came to know Jesus. You can too if you do not know Jesus Christ and you're listening to this podcast and maybe you're thinking, that's exactly what I need. You can stop right where you are and you can say, Lord, I need you. Right where you are, you can pray and say, Lord, I need you. Come into my life. I know and recognize and understand that your sins are in the way between you and God, and you can stop and say, forgive me of my sins and lead me from this day forward. Come save me. Romans 10:9 says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, that means he's an authority over all of it, everything, including your life. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Will you do that today? Finally, in all this, what about us as believers? Maybe you just need to stop right here where you are and say, Lord, help me. Help me to learn this art of when to speak and when not to. Lord, give me this discernment. In James, it says if we pray for wisdom, he'll give it to us liberally. Lord, give me this kind of wisdom that I can know when to speak and when not to. Help me to be wise. You can do that too as well. And I encourage you, get involved. Look people in the eye. Listen. Earn the right to be heard. And speak light. Speak words of light and encouragement. Be uplifting as much as you possibly can. Speak those things into the darkness. And where you have to stand your ground in moments, I'm not saying that you don't stand those grounds when you have to. But like the scripture says, as much as it's all possible, be peaceable amongst all men, as much as you possibly can. Because that does speak volumes, ladies and gentlemen. And oftentimes earns us the right to be heard. I don't know about you, but I really do. I really do want the things that I know to be true and the things that I understand for sure are right, to have power behind that. And at the moment that it needs to be spoken about, that I know that right timing and that the Lord has an open door in all of it. Thanks for listening today. Hope you guys have a great week. I will see you next Monday.